A very big shift. Whereas before, social issues were sort of the niche issues of, a small group of very passionate shareholders, but a small group of shareholders nonetheless, who had a loud microphone but not a lot of votes. That's, as recently as 10, 15 years ago. Now, the big sort of institutional investors care about these issues, and BlackRock issues statements on good corporate governance and, ESG and corporate social responsibility. State Street, Vanguard, between those three, they own about 60 to 70% of the U.S. equity market. And so when big players like that say, hey, board, you should care about this, it's meaningful. It's quite meaningful.
From the foundational areas like constitutional and corporate law to the emerging areas involving robots, gaming, or cryptocurrency, join us for Season 2 as these faculty members share how they are
taking care of business. Today's guest is a professor here at the FSU College of Law. He teaches everything from corporate finance and corporate governance to mergers and acquisitions. We welcome to the show Professor Jay Kesten. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
We're glad you're here. Complete in shorts and T-shirt. You're in your summer attire today.
It is very hot outside.
It's very hot outside, and it is summer after all in Florida, so as it should be. Well, let's just jump right out and talk a little bit about, if you could share with us, where'd you go to undergrad, where'd you go to law school, and how did you get to Tallahassee?
Sure. So I grew up in Canada, in Saskatchewan, and the cold there was not to my liking, and so I've consistently been trying to move someplace warmer ever since. I went to the West Coast in Vancouver and attended the University of British Columbia for undergrad. I have a history degree, and I loved Vancouver so much I stayed there for law school, and then after that, that was enough Vancouver for me. So I decided to practice and moved to Boston and lived in Boston for the better part of about 8 years. I was a corporate and securities litigator, and then I thought I would transition back to academia. So I did a master's at Harvard, and then was lucky enough to get a job here.
So history degree, undergrad.
Yes.
What did you want to do with that? Did you want to teach originally?
I had no idea.
No idea. Did you just enjoy history?
Yeah, so actually I had initially thought I was going to be a doctor, and my undergrad degree began with a whole bunch of science stuff. It was a genetics degree, and the genetics stuff was amazing. I loved it. The everything else that you have to do stuff, not so great.
The blood and cutting,
No,
just you were okay with that.
Inorganic chemistry.
Yeah, organic chem.
That wasn't doing it for me. Mm-hmm. So about 2.5 years in, I thought, this is not going to happen. And I went to my advisor and said, look, I still want to graduate in 4 years. What can I do? And he said, well, you've taken a bunch of history classes and some religious studies classes, and I think we can probably squeeze in a history degree.
What's the shortest route from here to graduation?
Exactly.
I think a lot of us get there in undergrad. Tell me what I'm close to, and let's just go ahead and knock this out.
Yeah.
But then you stayed after that. You have and I noticed on your resume, you have an LLM.
So my undergrad, my initial law degree is an LLB. So it's a Bachelor of Laws. That's the designation they used in Canada at the time. It comes from the English system. It's not an undergrad degree. It's the same as here. You take an undergrad, and then it's a 3-year law degree. We just call it something slightly differently. The LLM is a master's in law.
Okay. All right. And then you became a litigator.
Yeah. So I moved to Boston. I got picked up by a great firm. I thought it was going to be absolutely amazing. The work was absolutely amazing. And then the managing partner of the firm died and the firm dissolved.
Oh, wow.
So that was a little unsettling. I had moved to a new country, new city, didn't have a huge network of support. And a year later, I was out of a job. But luckily enough, when the firm dissolved, chunks of the partnership just moved to all the other big firms in town. And so I had a pretty good relationship with one of the litigation partners, and he said, you should come with us. So I did.
So how did that experience lend a hand to your teaching skills now? Do you go back and retrieve some of that you learned? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I feel quite strongly that corporate law, especially the more upper level stuff, is very hands-on and practical. right? There's a bunch of theory that goes into it, but these are actual transactions and actual, companies doing real things out in the world. And so being able to draw on the practice experience, I think, is really important. And I'm not a big war story person. There are very few, they don't hear any specific cases that I worked on or anything like that in class. But my understanding of the litigation process comes directly from what I was doing and kind of understanding the dynamics of who the plaintiffs in these cases are, what the motivations of, the shareholders who are bringing lawsuits and the board who is trying to defend. And sometimes you've got people who are conflicted, like the CEO has their own interests, and so they need to get separate lawyers, and you just hear there's a lot of dynamic at play.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. And so we ask everybody, what is business law to you? If you can define it, and how does what you teach kind of fit into that world of business law?
Yeah, so for me, business law is a really big umbrella. It's everything from, the introductory corporate law or unassociated or unincorporated business entities, closely held businesses. But then from there, it branches out to everything from sort of straight ahead corporate finance, which is one of the things I teach, which is how businesses raise money, to more litigation type stuff like securities regulation or mergers and acquisitions, through to things like tax, which Professor Khan teaches. Intellectual property obviously has a pretty big role in the corporate world today. You've got commercial law cases or commercial law classes that deal with banking and other kinds of consumer-based transactions. And then there's always, little windows into other areas of the law. Shockingly, we've got a little overlap between constitutional law and corporate law these days. So for me, it's a pretty wide area, and with a lot of different practice opportunities from once people graduate.
Awesome. All right, Jeff, you want to?
Yeah. Do you find? That's one of the things, Jay, that I think is great about having you teach these corporate finance, these really, what most people consider the hardcore kind of business classes, is that you were a litigator, right? I think that sometimes people think business law, all I'm doing is transactions. I'm the person who's running the deal, and instead you're on that other end. You've got to understand the business. You obviously got to understand the transaction, or you can't be a valid a very good litigator. But you're on that end as well. It's not. Sometimes we see this dichotomy as either I want to be a litigator or I want to be a transactional lawyer, and that's not the case as you've had the experience. So I think that's great for our students. Yeah,
and in practice, obviously a bunch of litigation is when the deal's fallen apart, or is in the process of falling apart. So you come in and there's a dispute about what the contract means, or what the securities were supposed to look like, or a failure of disclosure, things like that. But oftentimes in really big transactions, mergers and acquisitions is a great example, you get the litigators coming in right at the beginning to do sort of risk analysis and to spot, what pieces of these transactions are posing the most potential litigation risk going forward. And that advice can prevent these problems from ever happening. And so, obviously a big chunk of the work was the aftermath, but a significant piece of the work was getting in there in advance to advise on the structure of the transaction itself. Because one of the things that the deal planners care about is, what's the risk that this deal falls apart? You can't just assume everything's going to go perfectly, especially in super high stakes cases.
Yeah, every client I ever had said that's never going to be a problem. No. We're always going to be great. Everything's going to go great. Why are you talking about what happens when things go bad?
Yeah, partnership with two people? Yeah. How could that ever go wrong when it comes to voting?
If that were the case, we wouldn't need all these lawyers, right?
Well, sometimes the clients wonder why they're paying lawyers, and then they realize it later. Jay, one of the things too, obviously there's a lot going on in the business securities world. I mean, it's a fun time, obviously, for M&A and Elon Musk and securities. And is he following the law? Yeah, which is usually the answer is no. Do you bring that into the class?
As a litigator, I would say the answer is maybe.
It's always, allegedly.
Allegedly.
How do you bring? Do you bring that? Do you, as you said, is that something you bring into the class? I mean, is that something the the students grab hold of because they love to bring in what's going on in the real world?
Yeah, it depends on the class, but I'm teaching a class this summer, a mergers and acquisitions class, and it's a small group of students, about 10 students, and obviously they're taking M&A over the summer because they really want to be there. These are people who have self-selected because this is something they want to practice or they're really interested, and they hear what's going on in the news, and I'll have, I think what you want about the deal. Elon Musk has made my coming up with hypotheticals extraordinarily easy. I don't need to come up with those hypotheticals on my own. I just say, hey, did you see what Elon did yesterday? And so, for the transactions that are in the news, I try not to shoehorn it in places where it doesn't fit. But in an M&A class, when we talk about, when do you have to disclose your ownership of a stock, I say, okay, well, here's the statute, and that's a little bit dry. But here's Elon Musk buying a bunch of shares and then waiting 3 weeks to tell anybody about it. And you can see what the consequences of that are, and we can jump off of that.
Do you think that the students, again, kind of, is that an advantage for the students to see, all right, what I'm learning is actually relevant in the real world? I mean, I think sometimes that is the complaint of academia, right? That, I'm reading this 18th century case about boats with the same name. How does that have any effect on today? And so it's great, as you said, to just have these hypos ready and willing for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And these days the public markets, especially domestically, are really active, and there's been major changes, just partially in the law, but also just in the dynamics of the marketplace. Right, we've got all sorts of different ways that companies can raise money. You've got crowdfunding now, and a whole bunch of alternatives to full-blown public offerings. And those largely are aimed at smaller and mid-sized companies that, some of us are dealing with the big, huge firms, but most of the time your clients are smaller and mid-sized companies, maybe local regional companies that need money just like anybody else. And now they have so many more options rather than just going to a bank and borrowing privately. And so, there's been a lot of movement, and then obviously every time we have a financial crisis, there's amazing things to talk about, both in terms of regulatory and legal change, but also in terms of just understanding how the marketplace works. So, not that I'm cheering for market failures or recessions, but, there was a lot to talk about after the dot-com bubble collapsed, and a lot to talk about after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And then obviously COVID has had a pretty significant impact on, U.S. markets and companies' business operations and the kinds of risks that they need to be looking out for, and the obligations of the managers of these firms to take sort of enterprise risk management. Like, what do we do when a supply chain shuts down? What are our legal obligations? What are our obligations to consumers and suppliers and things like that?
Well, and just for my own interest, I mean, obviously, another thing, I hear what you're saying in the sense of all these things in the world change everything. And of course, one thing that's changing is inflation keeps going up, right? It's been decades probably since any planners or corporate finance people have dealt with these kind of interest rates. Does that have an effect too on the on not so much the law, but maybe on what people are concerned about in these areas and raising money obviously a little more expensive and so on and so forth?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of the litigation in the corporate finance arena comes from people who are trying to exit contracts because the world around them has changed. Right? I borrowed money at 5%. And now the interest rate is 2%, and I'm stuck paying 5%. Right. Or the opposite, right? I am lending somebody money at 3%, and now inflation's kicked it up to 7 or 8. Give me my money back so I can lend it out to somebody else for more. And the entire sort of modern valuation process, so that's from a litigation perspective, but the entire modern valuation process is based off of looking at the sort of underlying fundamentals of the market as your baseline. And so at the moment, and for the last 15 years, basically, the baseline's been more or less zero.
Yeah, free money, right? Yeah.
Now that it goes up, it complicates things substantially. So.
Let me ask one other thing, because I noticed and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, but on your scholarship, you've done a lot of nice work in the corporate governance area, and particularly sort of social corporate governance. And I think kind of you were ahead of the curve on that. I mean, that seems like a very big issue now as well, right? With these companies that are not only saying, you need to raise money, but you have this environmental concerns, social concerns. Corporations need to step up, and, or there's more pressure for corporations to sort of step in on these kind of issues and make a statement. Is that also a major shift in the corporate scholarship world, in the corporate or in the practice of business law? Are we seeing a sort of glacial shift, or is this something that's going off a cliff and that companies again are getting ready to deal with this?
Yeah, so a very big shift. Whereas before, social issues were sort of the niche issues of, a small group of very passionate shareholders, but a small group of shareholders nonetheless, who had a loud microphone but not a lot of votes. That's, as recently as 10, 15 years ago. Now, the big sort of institutional investors care about these issues, and BlackRock issues statements on good corporate governance and, ESG and corporate social responsibility. State Street, Vanguard, between those three, they own about 60 to 70% of the U.S. equity market. And so when big players like that say, hey, board, you should care about this, it's meaningful. It's quite meaningful. And as the world gets more politicized, you see companies coming out on one side or the other, or refraining from coming out on one side or the other. And now we've got these overlaps between, for example, the business world and corporate decision making, and potential constitutional issues concerning, freedom of speech and government retaliation and so on. And so there have been a series of companies that have waded into ideological issues publicly, and there's been a whole range of reactions to that. Sometimes fallout, sometimes support, sometimes fights with the government, and it's fascinating. And one of the things that I'm fascinated with is, how are those decisions made? Right? What's the motivation for getting involved in something that relates to your business but isn't pure business? Is it a profit motive? Do I think I'm going to sell more products if I wade in this particular direction? Is it sort of customer facing? Right? Regardless of the profits, I'm trying to appeal to a certain customer base, and I think I need to take a position on that. Is it just ideology? And if so, whose? Is it just the CEO of the company, saying what they believe? Or is this a board decision where the management has sat down and they've come up with a PR plan and they're executing their PR plan? And that too is a lot different. Right? It used to be companies generally stayed out of politics publicly. Right? Behind the scenes, companies have always been playing politics by lobbying and, issuing donations to candidates and so on.
Yeah. Now you can't stay out of it. It seems like everything becomes political. And I wonder how that's going to affect our students in the long run, because they're still in that learning phase and soaking up. This is what transpires when I make this statement or my company goes in this direction. So what kind of advice would you give our current students as they go out into the working world, whether they know what they want to do or don't know what they want to do? What would you kind of give them this piece of advice before you leave FSU College of Law?
Wow. I mean, it's
very broad.
That's a really,
just pick one.
It's a really broad question. Yeah. I think at the beginning of your career, there's a lot to learn. Right? We do a lot of great work here at the law school, but the job of the law school is not to, tightly tailor your practice to a particular group of partners or a particular firm or a particular industry, because each of them have their own ways of doing things, their own approach, their own tone and dynamic. And so I think one of the most important things is to just keep an open mind, right? And to listen a lot and, to use what you know to add value. And I think a lot of our students graduate from FSU, and I hear from the lawyers at their firms that these folks are adding value almost immediately, right? But to really internalize what's going on, because it's the law school dynamic is very different than the corporate culture dynamic. And then to think carefully about whether that corporate culture works for you. Because, I think these days it's important to try to find a good match between my lifestyle, what I'm interested in doing, my long-term vision for my career, and making sure that that lines up with what's on offer.
Right. We had a great discussion with Fred Karlinski last week or two about big law and the difference between possibly working for big law versus working for government or a smaller boutique firm. And, he kind of said the same thing. Make sure that is what fits your lifestyle. That large environment, very competitive, a lot of hours a week. You may think you want this, and you may, I like kind of your advice, keep your mind open. You may get there, and that may not be what's for you. And I think that's all about learning and growing, especially in your early 20s. So.
Yeah. Just one follow-up piece of advice, though, and this is directly to the students: reach high when you're first looking for jobs.
Yeah.
Because it is way easier to start out at a big law firm, spend 2 or 3 years there, and realize, well, maybe this isn't for me, and then transition out, than it is to be cautious at first and say, maybe this wasn't as broad as I'd hoped. Maybe this isn't as, as exciting as I hoped, or I wanted to live in a different city. It's way easier to go to Atlanta and then come back than it is to start and then try to expand outwards, right? Your credentials coming out of law school are going to be very shiny at the outset, but they become much less important 4 or 5 years down the road, right? Your law school grades are way less important than your book of business and your practice experience and things like that. So,
I want to ask you about one more thing on your resume that I found a little interesting that we have not touched on, that you are the faculty advisor for the FSU Fencing Club.
Yeah, so that's pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID.
After, when
Do they still have it?
The FSU Fencing Club, I believe, still exists.
Okay.
I don't know what their current practice schedule or anything is,
Okay.
because, like I said, when COVID hit, I sort of said,
Sure.
I'm going to withdraw my services from this.
So do you fence? Is that the correct usage of the word? You fence?
Indeed,
Okay.
indeed. I was a fencer in high school and college,
Okay.
and when I moved to Tallahassee, I tried, my best to get back into it. I'm now an old man, so it's not quite the same. But I continue to fence. I haven't, like I said, in the last few years because of COVID-related stuff. But they all the clubs at FSU need a faculty advisor, and I was there, and they said, hey, you're faculty. Do you want to be our advisor? And I said, absolutely.
How many do we have on the fencing team at FSU, or how many did we have approximately?
So it's not a varsity sport here at
Okay.
FSU, so there's no team per se, but we would usually have, groups of 30 or 40 students.
Okay.
Not all of them would show up to every practice, but you've got a pretty good number of people.
Not as quite as high profile as the football team. Is that what you're saying? It's a little lower
the
profile.
quality over quantity.
Okay.
Are the the name image likeness deals available too?
I mean,
Absolutely.
if somebody's looking to sponsor me,
Seems to me fencing and then fencing. I mean, it just fits perfectly.
Yeah.
It's lots of options.
I agree. I can definitely see some fencers making it big time with an IL and
Sick.
just calling it a day.
There are actually, well, this is way off, but there are universities that have a fencing team.
Absolutely. No,
Apparently
absolutely.
Notre Dame won
Notre
the
Dame's got a
championship
great
or
one.
something.
Yeah.
A lot of the schools in the Northeast had like actual fencing teams,
Yeah.
and so when I lived in Boston, I fenced
Okay.
at the Boston Fencing Club, which I think is either the oldest or the second oldest fencing club in the States, and that was huge. That was like 500 people in multiple gymnasiums, all practicing with like the Olympic coach, which was great.
Is it like a workout when you're doing it? Do you actually get your heart rate up there? Is it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I know no one who
yeah.
fences. No, I know nothing about it. Absolutely, other than you poke the sword at people. But there's a blunt tip, right? And you get points for different parts of like whatever you hit.
So the tip is actually a depressive tip.
Okay.
And it breaks a circuit. So everything's electrical these days, and when you hit somebody, it depresses the tip, and if it puts enough pressure on it, the light goes off, and you can tell if you've hit or not.
Oh, there you go.
And
Okay.
there are 3 different weapons. The different weapons have different target areas, so you're right. Sometimes you hit people and you get a point. Sometimes it's off target.
Okay. Learn something new about people every time we're in here, Jeff. Every time.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, before we exit the show today, we're going to ask you a few little of our quick series questions just to get to know a little bit more about Professor Kesten. I bet there's some students tuning in. They're like, okay, we want to know more about him. This is their chance. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Night owl.
What do you do at night?
I mean, everything that I didn't do in the morning.
Workout? Because Jeff and I are morning workout people. So is that what you're doing at 10
I
o'clock?
can neither confirm nor deny. I need to get back on the serious workout.
Okay,
train
are
this summer.
you watching any specific programming at night?
So I just tuned into Cowboy Bebop.
What
So
is that?
The live or the
live
cartoon?
one. Yeah, so it's an anime show that I've heard from. I'm not a huge anime person, but I've watched some. And I've heard from everybody who's into that kind of thing, even people who aren't like seriously into it, that this is like one of the best animated series ever. I've never watched.
Anime. You said anime, not animated, right? Anime.
It
Well,
is,
It is animated, but it is anime.
Correct.
Okay.
There's now a live action show
Cowboy Bebop.
with John Cho and a bunch of other great casting members. And I'm now, I think, 3 episodes in, and it's really fun.
What network is this on?
It's
I think
Netflix.
it's on Netflix.
It's on
yeah.
Netflix?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. How do you take your coffee?
I drink an Americano with cream.
Okay. It's pretty just regular, middle of the road. We had a couple of non-coffee drinkers
We've
on,
had
and
3 or
we're
4
just in
people that
shock.
don't
Like,
drink coffee.
I don't even know how to follow that question. They say I don't drink coffee. I'm like, I don't know where to go with
We think
that.
they're aliens.
But you have your coffee in here, so clearly I knew you were not one
I
of
do
them.
have my coffee in here.
Okay. What is one movie you could watch over and over again? Are you mulling between a couple of them? Because you can go with more than one if there's like a
I am
top 3.
I am mulling in an attempt to preserve my own image.
pick, choose wisely, my friend.
Yeah, no, exactly. Speaking of choose wisely, I will watch Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade.
Good choice.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Anytime it's on TV, I will watch that. Absolutely.
Not Last Crusade is not the one with the skull. No, that's the Crystal Skull. That one was
Yeah,
it
that
got
doesn't
a little
exist.
off the
We don't admit
railroad.
that one.
We don't.
Yeah, we don't talk about
It's
that.
either Temple of Doom
It
or
ended at that one. It ended at 3.
There are only 6 Star Wars movies.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, here we
Maybe
go.
3.
Here we go. Let's not go. So you're a Star Wars person.
Yeah, I grew up with Star Wars.
Okay.
I was born in September, and I believe that the original Star Wars came out in August. And I'm told that this might be complete made up, but this is just what my parents told me. I'm told that they went to see it when I was 8 months pregnant, and that just implanted in my brain.
Absolutely, it did. Absolutely, it did.
I wasn't 8 months. My mom was.
So have you gone back
Pretty
and watched the original ones after watching the new ones? Because I was in shock at how, I won't say bad because it's just a great series. We're big Star Wars people, and my son actually speaks Mandalorian. I told him if he invested that much time in his studies at school, he would have been, we could have been like valedictorian here. But no, we invested a lot of time speaking Mandalorian, which is super helpful in the working world. But
You never know what the trends are going to
Yeah,
be.
listen,
exactly.
he had a Padawan braid growing up. I'm telling you, we're super Star Wars people. So when you go back and watch the original ones, they're slightly different, a little less impactful.
They've still held up, I think.
So I think they've held up really well.
Yeah.
Okay,
You go back and watch another sort of sci-fi movie from 1977,
Yeah.
and my children are like, "What is this?
Yeah.
Like, did they put like clay together?" And then like just move the arms,
Yes.
the stop motion stuff, and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what they did. And they say, no, we can't watch that. That's terrible.
And there's no blood. When you really go
blood.
back, when I started showing it to my children, there's no blood. There's no bad language. It is really, really appeals to a broad audience.
Yep. I think it holds up. The sad thing is you can't actually go watch the original ones because
Right.
George Lucas recalled all of them
Yeah.
and added in a bunch of
Unnecessary stuff.
better
True.
special effects.
True. Unless you have a VHS at your house and can pop it back in.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jay, we have really enjoyed having you on the show today. We appreciate your time this summer and look forward to seeing you back in the fall for in-person classes.
Been fun to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.
This podcast made possible by a generous donation from Jeff and Aggie Stoops.
Special thanks to FSU College of Law's Professor Sean Barron for creating our theme music.